Rachel, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's great to be here again.
Rachel, so for those, give us an introduction to you, for those who haven't come across you before on this session.
So I am a neuroscientist, and my primary area of expertise is the sense of smell. And I have been studying the sense of smell for over 30 years, and really sort of everything to do with the psychological science of it and other aspects of it as well, physiological. And most recently, I've been getting into sort of looking at the connection between smell and health from two different perspectives, one being sort of what we might call aromatherapy, although I call it real aromatherapy. That is the science behind specific scents and how they can impact our mental and physical well-being, as well as the connection between certain diseases and smell loss and general physical and neurological health, and how that's connected to the sense of smell. So that's kind of one of the more recent things I've been involved with, as well as actually, and I'm going to mention this when I first get started, looking at how people value their sense of smell out there in the wider world. And unfortunately, even though COVID has really brought smell to the forefront, I think much more so than it ever was before, people still don't quite realize how important the sense is. So I'll be giving you a little bit more detail on that.
Thank you. And I think it's one of the things that Fifth Sense has had to do, which I think surprised us a little bit when Fifth Sense took off, that it was that piece of education that of the understanding of what sense of smell means. We don't realise what we have until it's gone, perhaps, on that one. What got you interested in this area in the first place?
Well, I was a biology major as an undergraduate, and for my master's and my PhD, I was trying to sort of figure out at the time, they didn't really have a field called neuroscience. It was called biopsychology. And so I was sort of trying to figure my way around that and see where I could sort of bring the concepts of sort of psychological processes and biological mechanisms together. And I actually read a paper where the authors used smell to manipulate mood, and they described it, very much linked to neuroanatomy and also evolution. I had a big background in both those things, and I went, aha, this is how I can marry psychology and biology. And also I had been interested for a really long time in why it was that people said that smells were the best triggers for memories. And there really didn't seem to be a satisfying answer to that, which is what I spent my PhD researching. And finally, I've always been a very sensory person, and I always have loved smelling things. And so I think that just naturally brought everything together for me.
And I imagine over that time, because you crackled a little bit when you said the time, did you say 30 years you've been involved?
I did say actually more than 30 years now. A little bit more than 30 years, yeah.
And it's, I mean, unbelievably, for it being one of our 5 major senses, it's an incredibly understudied area. I imagine you've been opening up the whole area as you've been going. There wasn't a space for you to step into here.
Yes, I mean, it is underfunded, under-researched, and it is unfortunately underappreciated by just about everyone from the medical community to the general public. And so, I have, of course, and partially, one of the reasons why I'm so enthusiastic about Fifth Sense is I really have always been an advocate for teaching people about the sense of smell, expanding people's awareness of the importance of the sense of smell. So this is really near and dear to me. And, I appreciate that half of the audience is actually people who have a sense of smell, and it's very hard for them often to understand what it's like to not have one. I hope to give you a little bit of a walkthrough of what that might be like. And also I find it, I'm really glad that there are so many congenital anosmics who are in this audience as well, because that's actually a category where the experience is fairly different, because never having had a sense of smell, the brain actually rewires itself somewhat differently than if you've had it and you lose it. So the profound situations that are sort of tragic of people who've had it and lost it don't typically affect people who have been born without a sense of smell. Although being born without a sense of smell is actually quite rare. So it is really interesting that there are, so many people in this community. And I'm sure that they have a lot to be able to share on how to, cope with some of the things I'll be talking about today.
Absolutely. Well, Rachel, I'd love to hear your presentation. Just give us a background to this presentation, because you did say it briefly just before people were coming on.
So if I could, should I share a screen?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
So. You should be allowed to. Got it?
Okay, yes. Should I get going or should I?
Yeah, you said you're giving this to, this is a presentation that you put together for a medical
Yeah,
group. Is that right?
so a few weeks ago, Fifth Sense was very involved in organizing a special session with the Royal Society of Medicine. And most of this presentation is the same as what I presented there, with a little bit more detail, including this opening slide, just to give a little bit more introduction. But if anyone was also on that presentation, then I apologize for the repeat here. But basically what I was doing when I was presenting to the Royal Society of Medicine was to give an overview to them, because they are the physicians who generally say, oh, well, are you eating okay? Well, in that case, fine, moving right along, and we don't really care that you have a smell loss. And what I was trying to do is really impress upon them that this is not just something trivial, that actually it affects every aspect of a person's life.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Rachel, I will switch my camera off. Over to you. Oops.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Tom, for that introduction. And what I just wanted to do to start with is to just give you a little bit of background as to where the impetus for me getting into this area of anosmia comes from. And that's because, I mean, some of you probably know that I wrote a book called The Scent of Desire. And this was actually predicated on my very first experience being an expert witness for somebody who had lost her sense of smell. And in this case, it was a car accident. And she had no idea prior to this unfortunate accident that her sense of smell was meaningful at all. She really couldn't care about her sense of smell. She didn't pay it any attention. And when I met her, it was over a year after her accident. And she had actually had fairly serious head injuries and had several surgeries and so forth. But by the time I met her, she was completely put back together, except for her sense of smell was gone, and that was permanent. And absolutely everything in her life had started to fall apart, from her marriage to her job, to her sense of self, to her emotional well-being. I mean, it was just really heart-wrenching to listen to her and to hear her also lament how she had never realized how the sense of smell was so important, so intrinsically involved in everything. And so this really moved me to want to share the importance of the sense of smell, and to get people to realize how much of a luxury and privilege it is to be able to smell the roses and everything else that we can smell that gives our life such richness. So that was really what motivated me to write this book, The Scent of Desire, now about almost 14 years ago. So from there, this is just a little bit of a background. I now want to sort of jump into what I'll be talking about today, which is basically sort of in a nutshell what some of the topics are in that book, and basically the psychological and quality of life impacts of smell loss, and what people who have a sense of smell typically don't appreciate. And one of the things that I also want to mention here, in terms of the fact of people not appreciating it, I kind of hinted at the fact that I was going to talk about something that I've been working on recently to see whether or not, or how much people value their sense of smell. And I put together a survey study where we had over 400 participants involved, and looked at things like, how much would you be willing to give up your sense of smell, hearing, or vision compared to a variety of both psychological and physical commodities. And just to give you an example, and this, in particular kind of blew my mind in not a good way. 25% of people said they would rather lose their sense of smell than their smartphone. 0 said they would rather lose vision, and about 4% said they would rather lose hearing than their smartphone. But can you believe it, that 25% of people said they would rather lose their sense of smell than their phone? So, I mean, this is really an unfortunate state of affairs. And like I said, I just did this study recently because I was hoping that as a function of COVID and the importance of smell getting out into the media and out into the general public so much more, that maybe the sense of smell would look a little bit more, at least like hearing. But unfortunately not. Unfortunately, still a quarter of people really don't care about it. And there are a whole variety of other things that I compared to, but that one to me in particular was just extremely stunning, because I put that in almost not quite as a joke, but just to sort of really see where things are. And hopefully that we're working on writing up this paper, and hopefully it'll be available soon. And when it is published, I'll certainly have it on the Fifth Sense website. But anyway, so moving along, one of the things, and Tom already gave you this sort of overview of how it is that we smell, but the reason why olfaction is so critically involved in our quality of life has to do with how it's connected to the basics of living in really direct ways. So here, If you can see my little arrow, these are the olfactory bulbs right here, and they synapse into the limbic system of the brain, and in particular, directly into this structure here called the amygdala, and this other one here called the hippocampus. And together, the amygdala and the hippocampus are what's involved in emotion, emotional memory, associative learning, spatial navigation, and a whole variety of tasks and experiences that we have. And that is actually what is known in terms of neuroanatomy as the primary olfactory cortex. In other words, this is where in the brain, numero uno, our sense of smell is being processed. So where emotion, emotional memory, associations, and so forth is processed, that's where smell is processed. And no other sensory system has this kind of unique and direct and privileged access. So another structure that's also highly involved, although not quite as directly, is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is part of the limbic system, and it's also involved in sexual behavior. So literally everything from emotion, emotional memory, learning, associative learning, spatial navigation. Actually, this is pretty interesting. I'll get to more of that later. Our general motivations for everything, including food, of course, and our sexual behavior are all linked to our sense of smell. So just to give you some basics here, and Tom already talked about it, when we experience the consumption of food and drink, we say the word taste all the time, but we almost never actually just mean taste, because taste is just the basic sensations of salt, sour, sweet, and bitter, and sometimes umami, depending on who you're talking to. There's also, as Tom mentioned, these oral sensations, heat or burning from hot peppers, or the feel of food like the creaminess or the crunchiness. But apart from that, everything that we call taste is actually flavor, and it comes from our nose, comes from the aroma molecules in our mouth while we're chewing, going up into the nasal cavity through a hole, an sort of passageway between the mouth and the nose while we're breathing and eating. And this combination of the direct taste of, let's say, sweet on our tongue for this cake over here, plus chocolate aroma, is what gives us the flavor sensation of eating this chocolate cake. And likewise, the pure taste of salt plus bacon aroma gives us this perception of bacon. Now, I should mention also that these are not simple, they're just, the one chocolate, the one bacon aroma. Actually, they're very, very complex. And for instance, bacon aroma is comprised of over 130 different volatile molecules. So what we're smelling is a complex chemical mixture. It's combining with the basic taste sensation in our mouth, and together, boom, causing the perception of flavor that we erroneously call taste. So just to give you an example though, and this is, the tastes of food, the flavors of food is what really is the primary experience of pleasure in our lives. Now, if you don't have their sense of smell, all you experience is the basic taste. And so if all you have is this experience of sweet, and you're eating this, but all you're getting is sweet, this is pretty unsatisfying. And if you're eating bacon and all you're getting is salt, it's also extremely unsatisfying. And basically, the pleasure of food becomes really eroded for people who have lost their sense of smell. And that's kind of the number one thing people sort of think of as being obvious when you lose your sense of smell, is something to do with, the joy of eating food. But it really, as you'll see, goes much deeper than that. But there's also sort of direct consequences from this lack of getting the pleasure of food that we get from aroma. And one of them has to do with nutrition. So unlike, there's obviously the great pleasure from the aroma of the chocolate, but as I just showed you from the slide previously, sweet is the primary taste sensation involved there. And sweet is actually also pleasurable in and of itself. Salty taste is pleasurable in and of itself, and fattiness, creaminess, oiliness, and so forth is also pleasurable in and of themselves. So if you don't have scent any longer, if you don't have the aroma of food anymore, and all you can get in terms of pleasure from eating is salt, sugar, and fat, then you are going to eat a lot of foods that are high in those macronutrients, and that is not particularly healthy, especially at the expense of eating things which would be flavorful but don't have, these necessarily unctuous, delicious, pure taste qualities. And so people's general nutrition tends to suffer when they lose their sense of smell. And this also typically spirals into changes in weight. So, for example, the person who has lost their sense of smell, initially may be desperately trying to get that pleasure back from eating bacon and chocolate. And so they try and try and try by eating lots of bacon and chocolate, and they end up gaining weight. And then often what happens after that is they sort of become very despondent and, oh my God, I'm never going to get that pleasure back. Food is just a complete turnoff, and they end up losing weight. So this is the sort of up and down yo-yoing effect. But typically in the long run, what happens is weight gain, because, like I said, the sort of really high hedonic qualities of salt, sugar, and fat keep people coming back for those sensations at the expense of better nutrition. So weight gain is one of the things that often happens long-term when people have lost their sense of smell and they don't know what they can do to mitigate that. And hopefully this conversation will also get into things that people can do to help make food a lot more pleasurable, even when you don't have a sense of smell. So another feature that seems relatively obvious has to do with general safety. We know that we use our noses to be able to sniff out danger. And one of the dangers that we sniff out is whether or not food has gone off. I mean, often there's some visual signal that that's happened, but we very often use our noses, and people are probably very familiar with doing that with milk. And 2/3 of people who have smell loss say they are not able to detect spoiled food. And this is actually quite significant, especially because there are about 2.4 million cases of foodborne illness reported in the UK every year. And so if people can't use their noses to detect that, that is contributing to foodborne illness experience. And, sometimes foodborne illness can actually be really severe and end up leading to death. So food safety is another area where our noses are extremely important. If we don't have them, we can really suffer as a result. Another is general home safety, and specifically for appliances that use natural gas. So for instance, your stove. And people who have natural gas in their home, the gas company typically adds a chemical to the gas because you actually can't smell it in and of itself. Natural gas has no odor in terms of its natural state, but they add a chemical so that if the pilot light has gone off in your stove, or if something else has gone wrong, you start smelling the accumulation of natural gas and can do something about it before your house explodes. And actually, no joke, I have worked with people who have suffered and or been almost involved in actually very serious gas-related situations as a function of the fact that they could not tell that gas was accumulating in the space around them because they'd lost their sense of smell. So maybe what's not quite as obvious, it's certainly not as obvious to the general public and to the medical community, is how much our sense of smell is involved in our emotional well-being. And that goes back to the slide I showed you earlier, that the primary olfactory cortex is where in the brain emotions are processed as well. And so what happens when people don't have a sense of smell, it's literally like if you can see sort of two sides of the equation in this neural structure, there's the smell processing and emotion processing. And if one side of that equation fails, the other side starts to falter as well. So when you don't have input from the sense of smell into the amygdala hippocampal complex, the functioning of the amygdala hippocampal complex starts to become maladaptive, let's just say. And this is part of what contributes to a general decline in emotional well-being, which can sometimes lead to very serious clinical depression. And the unfortunate situation here neurobiologically is that if the sense of smell loss is permanent, then this sort of malfunctioning in the amygdala hippocampal complex is going to be progressive because there's still no input, and whatever is going on, that can be progressive. Now, it doesn't have to be, and just as a little caveat, people who, lose their sense of smell do not necessarily fall into clinical depressive states, but it can happen and it can get worse with time. Another thing that tends to happen to people when they've lost their sense of smell is a great deal of difficulty and strife in their personal life and their social life. And one of the ways this manifests is in terms of being really paranoid about body smells and personal hygiene. And I have worked with many people who literally will shower 3 times a day or more because of the fact that they're worried that they're emitting body odor and they're brushing their teeth constantly, as well as, changing clothes constantly, bringing a change of clothes with them wherever they go. And this tends to also probably be, sort of more extreme as a function of what is going on emotionally in their life, and kind of this sort of obsessive and anxious state that is being precipitated by having lost our sense of smell. This can then further lead into other, downturns in personal life by deciding, and I have definitely worked with people like this who say, it's just not worth all the anxiety to try to socialize, and I am just going to stay indoors. And these people become reclusive, and this in itself is also, bad for one's social and emotional well-being. And so, and particularly, the situation that COVID has brought about, where we had lockdown and social isolation, and people who lost their sense of smell on top of that, who then may have been feeling this desire to shut themselves off socially, that the impact would have been, magnified that much more during a period of social isolation in general. So, people who are suffering from smell loss with COVID, that's a special case where you really have to work hard to sort of combat these tendencies to shut yourself off from your community. And in addition to the sort of general social relationships this can impact, it can also impact our experiences we have with loved ones. And one area in particular is with parent-child bonding. And this is actually especially important, usually for women because of the primary caregiver. It doesn't have to be for women, but generally when women who have suffered smell loss experience this, they're very traumatized because they feel, I can't smell my baby, I can't smell my children, I feel like I can't connect with them. And this person that I told you that I, sort of based, the desire to write The Scent of Desire on, told me that she had decided not to have children because she was really worried about not being able to bond with a child that she might have because she couldn't smell him or her. So this issue about not being able to bond and connect, or feeling like I used to be able to and now I can't, is very traumatizing for people who've lost their sense of smell. And this also is related to sexual relationships in quite a strong way. Many people who have experienced smell loss end up feeling like they don't want to be intimate with their partners anymore. They also can feel a general decline in sexual arousal in general. And for women specifically, it's been shown that the ability to orgasm is in fact related to the ability to smell. And people who've lost the ability to smell often to end up having a lot of sort of sexual dysfunction in that regard. And then this can be very difficult and straining in a relationship, for both partners, and especially for the, let's say, the osmic one that doesn't quite understand. So this is just another example of how broadly loss of smell can impact one's life overall. And now I just want to get into this other area as well, which is spatial navigation I mentioned earlier. And this is something people might not realize, but the sense of smell and our ability to navigate in the world and our spatial understanding of the relationships in the world is actually intrinsically tied to one another. Part of this has to do with the fact that the hippocampus, that area of the brain I showed you that is directly activated by scent, is where spatial learning and spatial memory is also coded. Another feature has to do with the fact that what's known as the secondary olfactory cortex is involved in processing spatial memory and spatial organization. And when you can't smell, it's also affected negatively. So there's this intrinsic relationship between spatial navigation and other sort of analytical skills as well that often fail when people have lost their sense of smell. And I've worked with people who've had high-level analytical jobs who have felt after they've lost their sense of smell that they can't work anymore because their brain just won't work like they want it to, and they can't do what they used to do. And this is very, very distressing because it feels like, why should part of my brain suddenly not be working right that I didn't think had anything to do with a sense of smell? And now I can't, go to work any longer. So this is actually something which more and more research is beginning to unfold and show how spatial navigation and our sense of smell are intrinsically linked. Relating to that in terms of cognitive skills is something called executive functioning. And it has two sides. One is the ability to control your emotions, and so not have a big outburst in the middle of the room, when you don't want to. And the other side of it is, planning and attention and other features that have to do with people's work life. And again, another reason why when people lose their sense of smell, they often feel like they can't do their jobs anymore. And especially if they've lost their sense of smell due to an accident where they've had some traumatic brain injury. If you have some traumatic brain injury and you also have loss of smell, then the impact on executive functioning is much worse. So you have a lot more difficulty controlling your emotions. You have a lot more difficulty planning and organizing and so forth. So there's a real connection here between our cognitive abilities and our sense of smell that most people don't recognize. And of course, what I started off my research on, all those years ago was this and is the very special connection between our sense of smell and our autobiographical past. So our ability to remember what happened to us before and to have the experience of having a sudden recollection from our past come back to us, sort of what is known as the Proust phenomena, when a scent can really transport us back to a time and place that actually we might otherwise have completely forgotten and never had as part of our life history if it weren't for that smell that brought us back. So that is to say that scents can actually dredge up pieces of our past life puzzle that we might never have found if we didn't have smell as a way to bring us to that memory. And these memories are also, because of the neuroanatomy of olfaction, much more emotional and much more evocative than memories you might have from your past that could be triggered by something you see or hear or read and so forth. So not that all autobiographical memory is gone, but that sort of really emotional, visceral, I'm really in that moment sensation that you have when you're experiencing a smell-connected memory is what people lose when they lose their sense of smell. So fundamentally, everything that I've been telling you about is connected to our sense of self. And therefore, people who've lost their sense of smell often have a profound sense of loss of their sense of self, which is, a global level of emotional distress that people who have a sense of smell just really don't appreciate or understand. That how could a sense that seems so trivial really break down a person so much that they really don't feel like they're connected to themselves anymore? And this is what I've really tried to educate the general public on, and to try to appreciate their sense of smell and realize how important it is. Because even if we don't have any traumatic injury or we don't have any viral infection, unfortunately, as we age, we tend to lose some of the sensitivity of our sense of our smell. And after the age of 85, many people are sort of effectively anosmic, although they don't realize it. And that's also a stage of life where people are experiencing cognitive difficulties in other ways, and actually trying to keep your sense of smell healthy and active is a way to also stave off other forms of decline that can happen in later life. So I'm sure you've heard of smell training as possibly a way, and not just possibly, but actually as a very good way of trying to reconnect your sense of smell when you've had viral infection, smell loss. But doing smell training just every day as part of a regular exercise routine is going to keep your sense of smell healthy and your brain healthy and your body healthy for as long as possible, and therefore your lifespan and your health span as good as it can be. And so just overall, just to summarize, I'm wanting to make the point of how our sense of smell is critical for everything, from the enjoyment of food, our physical health, our emotional health, our social and interpersonal relationships, our cognitive skills, our personal memories, our sense of self, and our overall quality of life. And just because I know that the audience is primarily in the UK, I wanted to say that this photograph of me was taken 2 years ago when I was visiting Oxford. So I was smelling a lovely rose in Oxford, and just appreciating how much the sense of smell can give us and what a glorious sense it is. So with that, I will say adieu and stop sharing my screen. So, and be happy to take any questions.
Fantastic, thank you. So let me just put me up as well. So we've got a few questions coming in the chat box. Do add any in there. I would love to get some verbal. Sorry, my camera keeps doing this soft focus thing on me. I don't know what I do. I might switch it off and start it on again. So do add any questions in there that you'd like to have answered, but we'll also do them verbally as well. To do that, if you could look down the bottom of your toolbar, you should see, it's done it again. Here it is. You should see a reactions button, and if under the reactions button, there's only one option there which really works for this, and that's the raise hand button. All of the other ones will disappear after a couple of seconds, and I'll lose you as a question. So any questions you have for Rachel, any comment you'd like to make, and just sort of perhaps get some clarification and open it up a little bit, very welcome to receive, clicking on the raise hand button. Got a few coming in. I was going to pick up one about congenital anosmics, but I see some of the people in the group who I know are congenital anosmics are got their hands raised. So if I come straight to you, Charlie. Hi.
Hi, yeah, we've been having a bit of a chat about kind of how everything you're saying is relating to congenital anosmia. I, for one, was very happy and impressed at the start when you kind of singled us out as actually a lot of these experiences don't necessarily relate to us because our brains are wired differently. And it's nice to be acknowledged like that. But some of the things that you were saying about spatial reasoning and like visual reasoning and things like that, I'm particularly good at those sort of things, despite having never had a sense of smell. And I'm wondering how many of these studies could or should be replicated with congenital anosmics to just see what the differences are.
Thank you. Rachel, before you answer, perhaps Josie, if I could go to come in as well, if you had anything else to add, because I saw you were putting some comments in.
No, I would definitely just repeat what Charlie said. That was what I was thinking. Right. And I just feel some of those things, I certainly agree with some of them. I do think I'm affected by some of those things. But yeah, I mean, I would love to know if there is any research or there's any planned research on congenital, because I just feel that, yeah, I mean, are we different to acquired anosmics, like how we relate to the world?
So I think acquired anosmia and congenital anosmia are definitely different. And like I said, so I think it's, first of all, it's a great idea and it should be done. You know, the problem is finding enough congenital anosmics to do a study with has not been easy. And, you know, I would love to be able to do one with you guys. So, you know, maybe we can work something out. But the issue that has been studied has been with people who have either a normal sense of smell or who have been in some kind of an accident or something and they have smell loss. Those are the sort of primary people who have been targeted for these studies, and looking at, for instance, spatial ability, that it was directly related. So, for example, people who were very good at forming cognitive maps and navigating around a virtual town, it was found that they had a larger area of the brain that's referred to as the secondary olfactory cortex, and that people who had smell, who were not so sensitive to smell or had smell dysfunction, that part of the brain was smaller. So, but that's not at all dealing with people who are congenitally anosmic, who might be perfectly, you know, good at this, in fact, maybe extremely good at this, and have nothing to do with their smell in terms of their spatial memory and processing. So this is something that definitely should be looked at. And as I said, to start off with, if you're born without a sense of smell, your brain is wired differently, so that, you know, abilities that might have been related to the sense of smell, if you were born with one, are now worked with in a different way. So, but it definitely should be the case that people with congenital anosmia should be studied.
Excellent. Thank you, Rachel. Within 30 seconds of you saying that, we had 4 volunteers. So we'll keep that open as a discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that is a really interesting question, and I'm really sorry for the situation you're dealing with, both with your son and also obviously your population pediatrically. And unfortunately, I really don't have a good answer for that. I mean, what is going on in the brain of someone who's experienced that kind of trauma? I can say, however, that post-traumatic stress disorder can be really tremendously intensely triggered by a scent when a scent has been part of that original trauma. And actually that you can work with people to use scent to try to relieve their trauma connected to the scent. And I've recently written a paper on sort of suggesting several ways that can be done sort of clinically to work with scent to try to undo the scent triggered trauma, as well as potentially also with people who have jobs where they are probably going to experience trauma, like rescue workers or military personnel and so forth, and that how they can become prepared for the olfactory quality that they might encounter during these traumas to protect themselves from then later on developing PTSD. But in terms of your particular situation and case with your son, I really don't know what to say. I'm sorry to say, unfortunately. So if I can, I'll start with the second part of your question, since it's actually easier for me to answer. Probably from the point of view of cooked food, the texture component of cooked food is going to be fairly homogeneous. So it's going to be soft in general. And the fact that also it's not giving you the flavor sensation. So you're just feeling this kind of soft texture, or, you know, not very variable texture, that becomes kind of unpleasant over time. And maybe also the heat from the food in general just creates a kind of somewhat aversive experience, because heat in and of itself, depending upon how hot it is, can be painful. Now, when you're eating cold food, you, first of all, cold in and of itself can be refreshing and pleasant. And also the textures of foods can be much more modulated. So you can have crunchy and creamy and a variety of other things going on in the same food. And that can make it a lot more interesting, a lot more involving, and a lot more pleasant. Now, in terms of the first part of your question, having to do with phantasmia, these phantom smell experiences, well, not being a clinician who works with this, but knowing some of the literature, what I can say is that typically having these sort of phantom smells seems to be more of a good thing when you've initially lost your sense of smell through a viral infection, because it's suggesting that, you know, your brain is still sort of concocting smells, and therefore it might be easier to get your sense of smell back. This is also relating to parosmia, people who smell something but doesn't smell like it should, or it doesn't smell good. That's also potentially a good indication that things are still wired right. The only thing I can say, and I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, and like I said, I'm not a clinician, so I don't want to say that I'm diagnosing this at all, but what I might suggest is, you know, unfortunately, that maybe having fewer of these phantom smells may mean that your viral anosmia could be, you know, more permanent than not. Again, I really don't want to say this to you because I'm not a clinician, having not done any testing, but just theoretically, based on what you're saying and what I know from the literature, I would think that that would be more likely as a possibility.
Thank you, Rich. I mean, there's sort of a few questions around sort of recovery and change, but just picking up on the main theme of what you said about how this can be, again, staying in the theme of those who've had it and then lost it, such an impact on the brain. And the brain can be very plastic. What sort of, how does the brain readjust and reorganize itself?
Well, you know, I mean, the brain is very plastic, but the sense of smell in particular is extremely plastic, and fluid and capable of learning. I mean, the ability to learn is sort of the primary modus operandus of the olfactory system, which is why, you know, smell training in and of itself is such an important thing to do, regardless of the health of your nose or your ability to smell or why you've lost your sense of smell. So that's one thing. I mean, from the point of view of how does the brain reorganize after an accident and things start to become wired differently. What I really only know about really what goes on in the primary olfactory cortex, like, you know, what I mentioned about this sort of two sides of an equation where the olfactory input isn't reaching the amygdala, and then you start getting sort of breakdown in how the amygdala is processing information. But in terms of how the brain might be taking over other functions, you know, this is a whole area. You know, it's got a big literature in phantom limb experiences, you know, people who've lost a limb and then other parts of their brain start sort of reacting to a sensation that they don't have any longer. But I really don't know the specifics of what could be going on with more complex reorganization after smell loss. Well, so this is a really fascinating area, and actually the data is fairly conflicted. I mean, there is some data that suggests that people who have autism tend to be extremely sensitive to smell and also to tactile sensations. And then there's other evidence to suggest that they actually have worse olfactory functioning. So Again, unfortunately, that's not really a very clean literature, and it potentially depends on, I could see this when people look at autism, they typically look at children, maybe having both to do with how these studies were conducted or the fact that they were children versus adults, maybe differences also between males and females in terms of what the outcomes might be. But there is certainly, there are certainly individuals, at least we can say that much, who have the experience of autism and an extremely intense sense of smell and, sort of disliking smells in general. And in terms of how that might relate to other functioning in the brain, I don't really know, but I mean, for instance, again, I'm not an autism expert, but one of the major symptoms of autism tends to be sort of in social and emotional engagement. And to the extent that olfaction is impaired, let's just say that look at that evidence, or even if it's extremely sensitive but overwhelming, that might be related to some of the difficulties people with autism have in social and emotional relationships.
You talked about the salt, fat, sugar sort of triangle. What is it about those foods that maintain their attraction?
Well, I mean, our desire for those foods is actually innate. This is sort of where, we run into problems with today's pantry of abundance, where we don't have to, climb over hill and dale to be able to find enough calories to survive to the next day. Here, most of us live in, a very privileged food environment with, unfortunately, access to too much salt, sugar, and fat. And the reason why salt, sugar, and fat are inherently appetitive or inherently rewarding is because they signal things that we need to be consuming in terms to keep us healthy and alive. So sugar, the taste of sweet, is a signal for carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are the simplest form of usable energy. We need carbohydrates to stay alive and to climb over hill and dale and find that food. So our attraction to carbohydrates is built in as a part of way of keeping us alive. Likewise for salt, salt is typically a signal that what we're consuming is protein. And we need protein. We need protein to stay alive and stay healthy. We also actually need salt. The body doesn't make its own salt. We need to consume salt, and salt is really important for, our general body function. If we don't have enough salt, we will die. And in terms of fat actually, from again going back to calories, is the biggest bang for your buck you can get in calories. So, if you're only going to eat a small amount of something, if it's fat, you get more calories than if any other taste sensation. And therefore, again, from the point of view of needing calories to stay alive and survive, fat in and of itself is a very desirable, very inherently pleasing sensation. And so when we don't have the aroma component, we just go back to those basic sensations as being rewarding. And because of the fact, especially in today's highly processed food environment, salt, sugar, and fat is going to be coupled with a lot of calories and usually, unfortunately, not a lot of nutrition. So cookies and cakes and potato chips and, pizza and French fries, all those things which are very tasty don't have a lot of inherent nutrition to them, but they are high in those qualities of carbohydrate, protein indicators at least, and fattiness.
But I'm hearing two things there. One is that we should avoid it because they're so high sort of concentration. But the other, actually, this is a very, very strong source of enjoyment that people with smells.
Yeah. So you don't want to give those foods up. I mean, basically, from the point of view of how to manage, your diet and your health when you have anosmia and you're craving these foods is, first of all, awareness is key. So knowing that you're maybe being drawn to foods that are not healthy and trying just to sort of have a balanced diet and be aware of that is something that's important. But also add oil to, let's say, a crunchy salad so that you're getting the crunch and, let's say, the feel of freshness in your mouth, but you're also getting oil and maybe you're also getting some salt. Add, definitely put sugar in things, eat things that are sweet. I don't want any, denial is not the way to go, but be aware and try to moderate and try to bring those qualities into foods that you're trying to eat because they're healthy. So for instance, again, for, let's say, vegetables, well, that you really don't like to eat those cooked carrots or whatever they are, they just taste like nothing to you, but adding some sugar to that when you're roasting them, that will make them more pleasant to eat. Works with kids as well.
I'm not a fan of carrots. I mean, I think somebody else said here that their sense of taste is very acute, and I think mine always has been anyway, but I can't bear carrots. They taste of soap to me, and I'm other people only. Thank you. Well, what other case on that, I think, is also finding the healthy oils and healthy fats as well. I personally have massive amounts of olive oil, and I know it's one of my big sources of pleasure. Thoughts around that one? How it can help?
Yes. So the trigeminal nerve is a totally separate nerve that's involved in our sensations of food and also our sensations of smell. It's the nerve that runs through the face. It runs through the nose and through the mouth. It's what makes your eyes tear when you're chopping onions. It's what makes you sneeze when you have, pepper in your nose right in front of you. And it's what gives the burning sensation of English mustard or red hot peppers, as well as the cooling sensation of mints and so forth. So, and that's both in your mouth and in your nose. You can get those sensations without having a sense of smell. So another way to augment food experiences is to capitalize on getting pleasure, if you do find it pleasurable, from some spice, some heat, some cooling. So using mint leaves or using peppers in your cooking and mixing that up with the different textures and so forth. So you're getting much more sensation from the meal than just the basic mush or whatever the texture is, or just the basic taste in and of itself, which we either want to try to rein in a little bit of, or in and of itself might be not so pleasing. So definitely using spice is something that you can do. One thing I should say is a little caveat to that is if you are a anosmic, but also a super taster, that is to say, this is a genetic thing, not anything to do with your predilections, but that you actually have more taste buds and that everything in your mouth is more intense to you, then, the trigeminal stuff can definitely be very helpful, but don't use too much of it, because then that can also cause discomfort if you're a super taster. So super tasters often find the burn of things too much. So that could be something that you can work out yourself if you know how you like it. There's many tragedies associated with COVID, and one of the ones which is really significant to all of us here is loss of smell. One of the sort of silver linings, like I said before, is much more public awareness. It also seems to be that more likely than not, people who have smell loss from COVID will get their sense of smell back. The vast majority of people actually do get their sense of smell back. There are people who still are struggling, and we don't know how long that might be. Really, we've only been living with COVID for about 1.5 years now. So it could be that even people who seem to have not had their sense of smell back could still get their sense of smell back. So that I think there's hope, first of all, for people who've had long-term smell loss. And COVID isn't the only virus, by the way, that can lead to this, as one of the other people who asked a question mentioned. But in any case, the other side of this, though, is while the person is experiencing the smell loss, is the distress that goes along with that. First of all, the distress of, oh my God, I suddenly can't use one of my senses, and that I had no idea that this was so important, and what's going to happen to me, and what does this mean? And so just the awareness of this loss is distressing. And then there are all the downstream effects that I showed you in the presentation, that depending upon how long somebody is dealing with this, they might start to fall into a depression in and of itself that's related to anosmia, or other sorts of things like their ability to perform in school, and what their abilities to work and so on. So the sort of long-term quality of their anosmia is really the issue here. And I would say that for the most part, these people will not suffer long-term, but to the extent that any of them do, and how long they've been suffering with it for, could impact these other aspects of their well-being. But I know smell training really does seem to be really vastly successful intervention for smell loss. And like I said, has these other benefits for cognition and other things, and keeping your brain healthy and keeping everything, healthy. So, for young people, middle-aged people, older people, smell loss, no smell loss, start sniffing. Well, certainly, sort of getting experiences with other people, experiences with your emotional life, but also thinking about, for instance, if you're doing smell training, thinking about what does the smell mean to you, even if you can't really smell it, but you know what it is. So you know that let's say you've just taken a spice out from the spice drawer that you used to really love, and it's connected to some special meals for you, maybe holiday time. So you know that this scent of cardamom is related to holiday, but you can't smell it. But while you're sniffing it, think about how that feeling of smelling it in the holiday made you feel. Think about what it meant to you, and that will help sort of enrich that experience in and of itself, and also help to potentially, reconnect what's going on in the brain and the nose to actually bring your sense of smell back. So generally speaking, just sort of adding to your environment from a sensory perspective can also just augment in general the experience you're having. So the music you're playing in the background while you're eating, that could actually add richness to your experience of food that you might not realize. The colors of the plates that you use, that can actually also change how sweet it is perceived to be, changed how salty something is perceived to be, changed how much you want to eat it. This is actually something that I wrote about a lot in my most recent book called Why You Eat What You Eat. But all of our senses are actually involved in our experience of food in particular. We just talked about that, and we can bring in our other senses to fill in the gaps when we don't have aroma. So we're not really getting flavor to the same extent. But generally speaking, I think knowledge is power, and being aware of all these issues really can give all of you the ability to sort of figure out what you need to do for yourself. And like I said, there's various resources I know Fifth Sense has, and I've written about in my books as well. So I hope that can help you.